from New York. Tom and Laura from upstate New York, and Serenity from Utah. Awesome. Hi, Cal from Little Rock. Kai. Hi, Kai from Little Rock, Arkansas. We got people from all over today. Joy, welcome back. Rebecca from Washington. Hi, Jacqueline from the UK. How about that? From CIIS. Yay. Hi, Glenda from Newark. Morgan from Sheboygan. It's wonderful to see you all. And we're going to get started in like 30 seconds. Very excited about today. Who else is here? Okay, let's go to the next slide. Hi, Colette from Michigan. Today, I'm here with Terry Marks-Tarlow, who is my mentor, my dissertation chair, and the guru of fractals, I think, in fractals in spiritual expansion, but also just as the science, the fractal epistemology, and how that affects how we can use that to expand our worldview. And Terry will introduce herself a little bit more, but I'm just really honored that she's here with us today. And our topic is the role of fractals in spiritual expansion. And let me just say that before we start, that once we do get started, Terry's gonna just take it from here. I'm gonna go off camera, so will Dee, and she will do her presentation, and then I'll come on at the end. If we have time for questions, we'll do questions. Terry's also agreed to stay a few minutes later, so that if those of you who need to leave on the hour can leave on the hour. And those of you who want to stay and ask a few questions are welcome to stay. So that's how it's gonna work. People are saying they're not hearing anything, Dee.
I've been able to hear you, Kathy. How about Terry and anybody else in the
Other
audience?
people are hearing. Morgan's hearing, Lauren's hearing, Rebecca's hearing. So I don't know, maybe those of you who can't hear are going to want to come out and come back in. Your mics are off, meaning we can't hear you. Okay, good. Okay. Yes, all of you are muted unless you, and let's go to the next slide. We have two ways to engage. The first way to engage is what you're already doing in the chat. And we have a very active chat a lot of times. So if you have a question or a comment, feel free to put it in the chat. We'll get to the questions at the end. The other way is to raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, then Dee Yin from Be Strong Families will unmute you, and then you'll need to unmute yourself, and then you will be able to talk. So before we get started, I also want to just remind people, our regulars, and let everybody know who's the first timer, that we have agreements. Be Strong Families has agreements whenever we do anything. And this is in recognition that we're co-creating this safe space for learning and growth. So these are our agreements. If you agree to the agreements, do like Felicia did, direct it to all panelists and attendees, and write "I agree" in the chat. And when we get the agreement flowing, I'm going to turn it over to Terry. So thank you again, Terry, for being here. Delighted to welcome you, and excited for the presentation. So I'm going to go off camera and turn it over to, I think now you are free to share.
Okay, I will start my sharing. Thank you so much, Kathy, for inviting me to present today. This is very exciting for me. For those of you who don't know, I am a clinical psychologist in Santa Monica. And I have written a fractal epistemology for scientific psychology, and Kathy and I are co-editors along with Yaakov Shapiro and Harris Friedman, who might also be here today. So this is a presentation of what is most interesting to me and exciting about this work. So for those of you who are having to deal with the pandemic, which is everybody, I find myself going out into nature, and I feel extremely lucky to live in Topanga, California, and to be able to go up to the top of my street and walk in nature. And this is my view. The other day when there were fires and there was a lot of darkness in the air because of the smoke, the coyotes were out in the morning, early in the morning, which is a very rare glimpse. And here's the view. Again, it's just breathtaking for me. And I find that I am so much more grounded when I go out into nature. And so the biophilia hypothesis came from the biologist Edward Wilson, who defines biophilia as the urge to affiliate with other forms of life. So basically, we are hardwired with an innate impulse to connect with nature and other life forms. And biophilia translates literally to a love of nature. And I believe this concept is a really important one because it captures how our own spirituality gets embodied very, very early in life when we go out into nature and we have these extraordinary experiences. So this little girl in the picture has the bliss of an open field, or at night we have the awe of gazing into the stars. And when we get a little bit of science behind that, we learn that we're seeing light from millions of years ago. Or in the daytime when there are clouds above us that have images that are evocative and we dream into those images. All of these aspects of nature are fractal. And so I think that fractals become like a bridge between our body, minds, and souls back to nature. How can you not look, this is again from my home, how can you not look into a landscape like this without just having your whole breath and chest expand with this kind of a view? So I think that fractals give us a whole new framework for understanding spirituality and for especially understanding the more extraordinary and transcendent experiences that we have. And this way of looking at things reaches beyond reductionism, which involves breaking complex wholes into parts, and instead is a very synthetic way, a very unified way to look at our worlds. And it's a way that brings our spirituality closer to nature, closer to what's organic, closer to how patterns form naturally, and growth and decay patterns as well, and the nature of boundaries that are open and complex rather than very simple and human-made. So all of this taps into what's mythic and what's universal. People tend to get rather intimidated at the thought of mathematics. And so for this reason, I want to urge you not to try to understand this too deeply. I'm going to go back and forth between very simple concepts and more complex ones and technical ones. But instead of using your left brain analytic mind, sit back and try to turn on your intuitive right brain side and let this material wash over you, especially if you haven't had any previous exposure to fractal geometry before. So I want to say it is very intuitive, and it's very much how intuition works, which I will cover later. So it can be very easy to just surrender to the process and then think about it later. We can talk about it later as well. I love this quote from a computer engineer at Art Matrix. If you like fractals, it's because you are made of them. If you can't stand fractals, it's because you can't stand yourself. It happens. So in general, how we see the world determines what we experience. Because our cortex, the human cortex, is very complex and it actually mixes perception with cognition. So what we experience with our senses is blended with our concepts of things. And in fact, that can be so complete that we almost can turn off our senses if we're very much in our conceptual mind. So we can start seeing table and lose the specifics of the table that's in front of us. And the traditional ways of understanding that come from science, we have reductionist stance. So that means that complex parts are broken into simple ones, that our universe was thought to be mechanical. In fact, the clockwork universe was the tradition, and this duck on the left shows how even organic structures were or processes were thought to be mechanical. Traditionally, opposites were polarized and there were clean boundaries between, and that's especially true in logic, where true and false were totally separate. And this way of thinking has tended to marginalize non-ordinary states and tended to marginalize spirituality. So thousands of years ago, Euclidean geometry came into the picture, and it really influenced how we do science and how we literally see the world. And it did feed the side of our brain, the left side of our brain, which is more analytic and more reductionist. And it assumes that parts can be separated from wholes, and then parts can be recombined into wholes. Unfortunately, fortunately, I'll say, that works very well for engineering things in our environment. And so technology has thrived, logic has thrived under this kind of a system, but it doesn't work very well for organic processes. So along came Benoit Mandelbrot in the 1970s. And he discovered or invented, depending on how you think about it, a brand new kind of math. So this type of math is a form of geometry that can model what was previously considered too complex and to really be able to model. And it is a very holistic and synthetic perspective, which works very well for spiritual processes. And from inside of this form of mathematics, parts become inseparable from wholes, and parts emerge out of wholes rather than combine to make wholes. This perspective would actually, because the two sides of our brain really do follow these two processes, with the left brain being more analytic and reductive and the right brain being more synthetic and sort of moving in opposite directions from parts to whole and whole to parts. But because we've always had this capacity inside of our intuition, fractals were actually known to the ancients because they underlie the Fibonacci sequence in math and the golden mean in sacred geometry. And many of you may have heard of sacred geometry, but you can see in art that the proportions that involve part to whole relationship being preserved have been known for a very, very long time. So the essence of a fractal is that it possesses two key properties. The first is self-similarity, and that means that the pattern of the whole recurs within the pattern of the parts. And then the second is scale invariance, which means that the pattern of the whole recurs on different size or time scales. And so these two properties are very related to one another. And if you look at the white image on the left, that's a linear fractal because there's a perfect reproduction of the parts to the whole. So if you see the V at the bottom here is reproduced here and then reproduced on ever smaller scales going up it, and it's exactly the same shape. Whereas the computer generated fern on the right is a nonlinear fractal because it has some randomness that is thrown into each of these new iterations. Each one is called an iteration. So how did this revolution begin? Well, as happens again and again in history, there is a discovery first in art that then precedes scientific discovery. So if we look at M.C. Escher's Circuit Limit 3 from 1959, you can see that the pattern, the larger scaled pattern, the shapes are reproduced in ever smaller ways as it gets closer to the boundary zone. And so that is a good example of self-similarity as well as the scale invariance, because it's the same pattern that just gets smaller and smaller as we get closer to the edges. And here's my favorite, is Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss is so full of fractal images that we can see the cat in the hat, ever smaller cats inside of the hats, this recursive sequence that has cats and hats in ever smaller ways, or these creatures that have the same shape and they're not quite identical, and so it's a more nonlinear, or the structures of houses on the right. So animals and houses in the world of Dr. Seuss have been fractal well before fractal geometry actually was discovered. Now, I have a theory that because the generation of Mandelbrot and others, and chaos theory and nonlinear dynamics were brought up as children with Dr. Seuss, that these forms and shapes entered their unconscious mind and made it easier for this discovery to come out when it did. In fact, I believe that fractals may even be a stage of children's art. And so my daughter, when she was 5, Darby, spontaneously drew these heart people. And if we had time and I were interacting directly with people in the audience who are parents, if I were to ask you how many of your children have this kind of drawing where it's either a heart, a diamond, a square, etc., on different size scales, that I would guess most of you would say your children have drawn this kind of drawing spontaneously, and that this is indeed an unrecognized stage of children's art. Now, I have a theory about why children play with these shapes naturally when they do art, which is think about how our eye works, that when somebody stands very far away from us, the projection onto the relatively flat part of our eye of our retina will be very small. As that person comes towards us, that image will grow larger and larger. So that is an example of self-similarity in everyday life that is completely natural to us. And so in the same way that many of children's games and parents playing with children will do things like play peekaboo, which plays with the idea of people being there and not there, then when children play with shapes like this, they're playing with the idea of people being closer and farther away, more intimate, more distant. And so I think this is why this is a very natural stage of children's art. And it's also very common for fractal toys to exist. Almost every child has played with these kinds of nesting cups and nesting blocks and nested dolls. In this case, you can see those nested dolls, Marashushkas, something like that, are almost identical, but not quite. So again, that is a nonlinear type of progression. And it's a recursive one, each nested inside of the other, much like these nesting cups. And these types of toys come from all over the world. So I have, for example, a sister-in-law who is South African, and she has sent me little huts that are nested huts, one inside of another, from South Africa. It's my belief and contention that fractal geometry represents what I'll call a meta level of pattern, which means the pattern of patterns, how identity formation occurs in nature. So fractals and identity are very much entwined. And so now I'm going to take you on a slideshow of how and where fractals appear in nature. So we'll start with the cosmic level, that how stars cluster into galaxies has a fractal shape to it. The pattern of clouds, various patterns of clouds are all fractal. Now, I want to say something about clouds that's really interesting, that because of this notion of scale invariance, which, as I mentioned, means that a similar pattern exists on all size scales, from the very tiny to the larger shape. What this means is that when pilots used to fly, before there was navigation, radar navigation, it could be very dangerous when they got inside of a cloud bank, for this very reason of scale invariance, because all of a sudden, when inside of clouds, because of this property, there was no way to tell distance. Here is my daughter, Darby. You can see how young she was when she did the fractal heart people. That was our family, by the way. Oh, and actually something I wanted to say about that. Actually, let me go back for a second and I want to say something about that. So this is our family. You can see father, mother, and in this one, she has herself as the next larger size, and she has her brother as the smallest. But in real life, her brother is 2 years older than her. And so I think she was playing there as well with size in a different way to make herself more important and larger than her brother. So that was another interesting, more metaphorical way that she was playing with the size. Anyway, back to fractals in nature. So this is from Iceland, an incredible waterfall where you can see how this kind of recursive branching of the water exists in the everyday level. And here you can see how water going through land in an erosive sort of way also has this fractal shape. This one is from Death Valley, a photograph that I took of Zabriskie Point. And so you can see how mountainscapes are also fractal in shape. And just absolutely breathtaking when nature forms these fractal shapes, and they come out of chaotic processes. So often when two chaotic processes come together, like a stone and the water flows over the stone, then the erosion patterns, the shape that's left is the fractal residue of the meeting of two chaotic processes. You can see that minerals also have fractal structure to them, and absolutely gorgeous, very different in very, very different ways. These are recursive rings in the middle of this one, and these are more square-like ones and longer shapes. So each one has its own characteristic way of forming fractals. And then you can see that even at the subatomic level, that at the quantum level, that there are fractal processes at work. And so they are spanning the full size from the subatomic level all the way to the cosmic level, and all the way in between at the meso level of our everyday experience. And moving on towards life processes and bacteria, you can see diffusion processes on the right, bacteria and diatoms on the left. Beautiful, again, beautiful cellular processes that are fractal, that are colorful, just whole other realms of nature that are too small for the naked eye, but come to life under magnification. And in the sea, these are various forms of coral that also each have a very distinctive characteristic fractal structure to them, self-similar, scale invariant. Cactuses are a really good example. This comes from Huntington Park in California, which I believe has the largest cactus gardens in the whole world. And we come to plants, and you can see that beautiful spiral process, and I'll have more to say about spirals in a little bit and growth processes. But again, you can see how the structure of the branching pattern has that fractal spiral to it. And what's become very popular is this Romanesque kind of cauliflower that also has this fractal shape, but so do artichokes and all of these just beautiful star-like cabbage. Flowers, petals, self-similar structure. So you can see all throughout nature, there are fractal processes at every level, in the bloom of the flowers, in how the leaves work, in the cells of plants, cells of animals. Here's the inside of a sunflower, and the shape of the spiral has the Fibonacci sequence in it, the mathematical sequence, which is a very simple one where you just keep adding the numbers together. So 1 and 1 make 2, and 2 and 1 make 3, and etc. Up to 5 and then 8, etc. You just keep adding the two numbers together. And here you can see the same kind of processes going on in the webs of the spider. And again, it's somewhat irregular, but very beautiful, very complex. And if you look at the skin, our skin, human skin, has a fractal structure to the pores, and these gorgeous coloration of animal skins also have this fractal structure to them. Or you look at the eyes of the peacock, and there are many different places in this photo that has the fractal structure to it. And here's, you can see the fractal structure here as well in these fireworks. And so here we're starting to move towards human constructions. And something that I didn't say earlier, but which is really important, is that it's not just patterns in space, but it's also patterns in time that have this structure to it. And unfortunately, the spread of pandemics or epidemics are also has this fractal structure to it. So the interconnectivity is has the fractal as well. Spread of rumors. So I want to say that, and you can see from the fingerprints that all that makes us unique and recognizable may be fractal in nature. And especially our physiology is filled with these similar kind of fractal branching patterns that I showed you in the fern. So if you look at the pattern of the lungs, you can see this characteristic V that starts with the big branch and goes into ever smaller ones. If you look at the pattern of the neuron, you can see similar kinds of branching structures and the very same kind of branching structures in the patterns of the arteries. So let me show you, there are several different ways that fractals can be created. I'm going to show you here one of them, and this is a growth algorithm. It's growth by accretion. So you start with a seed shape. And so starting with this triangle up at the top, if you take one side and you replace it with 3/4 of a triangle over here and do that on all sides, then you wind up with a star. If you take each of those sides and replace them with 3/4 of, or 2/3, sorry, 2/3 of a triangle, not 3/4, you come up with the next stage here, and they do the same thing, and you keep going, and you can go, each iteration is adding new structure, new complexity, even though it's not changing the volume. And, but it is getting ever and ever more complex on its edges. So if we apply this to a neuron in nature, you can see how this is, A is the seed shape, and then this little branch is added to it, and then branches on branches, and by, you keep going, by F, you get, the actual Purkinje cell of the guinea pig looks very much like this fractal model here. So an important way of understanding fractals is as process structures. And so coming back to the spiral of the shell, you can see how the internal chambers are self-similar, getting larger and larger as it goes. And what happens is that as the, whether it's a snail, say the snail grows, it's the same shape that is preserved as the snail gets larger and larger. And so the identity of the snail is getting preserved. The part-whole relationship gets preserved. And so this is a way that time gets etched into space in terms of self-similar structure as the snail grows, or in the case of temporal processes, space becomes etched into time in what's called a power law distribution, which is very different from our normal distribution that we're used to. So I showed you before a fractal structure building growth process by accretion, and here is a decay algorithm. So either structure can be built or structure can be taken away. So if you start here with the same triangle, but what we're doing is taking out the middle third of a triangle, and then for each of those, taking out the middle third, and you keep going, and you wind up with a shape called a Sierpinski triangle here. And it's the same kind of process, except the structure gets, it gets more and more weakened in a sense as more structure, it gets more delicate as structure gets taken away. So here on the left, you can see how decay processes in nature are fractal. And on the right, extraordinary picture of this woman's wrinkles. And it's very easy to see with a face like that, how the emotional history of each person over time gets etched into the fractal wrinkles of our faces. So when you think about it, as babies, all babies resemble one another in being very smooth, and time has not yet, time and emotional history has not yet become etched into the face. And so those happen in time, each emotional instance, all the events of our life. And then over time, our face becomes a record of our entire history to some degree in getting either laugh lines, cry lines, scowls, etc., getting into the place where we can't hide our emotions any longer. So fractals tend to form at the edges, here at the edges of what's inside and outside. And you can see in these indigenous Indian structures, you can see how they're in between the outside of the rock formation and the rock formation and the outside world, which is actually what much of architecture does, is it's fractal structure that separates inside from outside. So here's a good example. There are many, many different styles of architecture that are fractal. And another person who recognized the importance of fractal geometry before there was fractal geometry was the psychologist, art psychologist, Rudi Arnheim. And very interesting, very astutely, he noticed that in buildings that the shape of the whole is often mimicked in the shape of the parts, and that will happen very often around the doors and the windows, so that as a person is coming closer to entering a building, they still have the representation of the whole in the part as they walk through the door. So in a way, having a self-similar repetition becomes a way of retaining the perspective of the whole and easing transition from outside to inside the building. So fractals tend to bridge space, time, culture, and the imagination. So you can see on the right, Rupert Murdoch's War on Journalism has this fractal structure, the self-similar parts that resembles very much this African sculpture. And there is in Dogon culture in Africa, the human shape is, the human form is the seed shape. And in that culture, it tends to go from the tiniest detail on the outside of a building to the shape of the hut, which has a human form, to the shape of the whole village, to the shape of the cosmos, religious. So we start to see how spirituality gets wrapped up into and continuous with everyday life in African culture through fractals, whereas it tends to be somewhat more separated in some of the Western forms of religion, although the mystical forms do not separate in the same way. There is a beautiful book by Ron Eglash called African Fractals, and he was a cyberneticist who also is a cross-cultural person who went to Africa and found how organic and naturally in many African cultures, there's self-similar structures. So here on the left is a photograph of the Baila settlement. And on the right, you can see how the whole shape of the village has multiple iterations that are self-similar. Here's a second example, city of within Cameroon, a very different shape. These are more square, but they're also they're nonlinear. And you can see the self-similar structure here. And you can see in the shape of the patterns is really, really complex hairstyles. Again, even in a simple braid, a very simple braid has a self-similar structure to it. So a lot of adornments, a lot of jewelry has self-similar structure. So now we go to the granddaddy of all fractals, which is the Mandelbrot set. It's a very, very simple formula of z squared plus c, which is iterated by computer on the complex number plane. So if you think of this formula as applying to every single point on the complex number plane, you wind up with this Mandelbrot set, which is considered the most complex mathematical object known to humankind and the granddaddy of all fractals. And you can see the self-similarity. This square here is now magnified here in B. So this is A, this is the shape of the whole. It's magnified here. And you can see little, I like to call this the Buddha bug shape. You can see little examples of the same shape over and over that are appearing. And then right here is another little square that's magnified in C. And this opens up all of these new unpredictable shapes, beautiful shapes that look kind of like psychedelic paisleys as each scale gets magnified. And then here is a little box. And when we magnify that one in D, the shape of the whole returns again. And so you can see that at higher and higher magnification. So the computer's being used like a microscope, zooming in, and you can see how the pattern of the whole winds up popping up unpredictably in various places in this Mandelbrot. This is called a Mandelbrot zoom. Here it is again. This time it's colored differently and it's presented as art. So probably a lot of you have seen various forms of fractal geometry as art. And I'm now going to show you various examples of that. So this is the Mandelbrot set. And here it is, you can see it again. And these are the various branches. And the coloration is done by different areas of magnification are colored with different colors. So that's how that's done. It's a purely technical equating certain range with certain colors, but it makes such a difference and it's so beautiful depending on how it's colored. Here it is again. If you're interested in seeing more of this and in particularly psychedelic possibilities, then I suggest going on to YouTube and looking up some Mandelbrot zooms, and you'll be able to see the zooming process. And over time, the zooms have gotten deeper and deeper as the computer gets run. You can see why it took the computer to actually be able to visualize these shapes. And this is why it wasn't until the 1970s or so that that we were able to really discover this form of geometry, because the computer needs to plug that formula back in recursively. So the end product gets plugged in as the new beginning, and it keeps going and going and going. And actually, let me go back. I want to show you something about this. In this, so as I mentioned, this formula is plugged in for each place on the complex number plane, and where it goes to infinity is the white area. Where it settles down to a just an end product and it goes no more is the black. And the Mandelbrot set is this very, very complex edge in between essentially order and chaos, or finite and infinite processes. Some more fractal art. So fractals arise at the intersection of math, art, and science. On the right, you can see this is top and bottom are the very same fractal structure. It's exactly the same view, but it's colored differently. And so now we can begin to see how, if we think of our own emotional palettes as what we're bringing into the world and what we are projecting out into the world, we can see how each one of us can look out into the same world, but have a very different perspective. So this is a beautiful model of how different emotional palettes and subjectivity can have can look out into the very same world. And it's really a model of external reality as collectively defined. So fractals abound in art, and they have been used by a physicist named Richard Taylor, who's done a lot of research on fractals in perception and how the aesthetics of fractals in nature, which we absolutely have an aesthetic very close to fractals in nature. So this Jackson Pollock is analyzed by Richard Taylor by its fractional dimensionality. And I'll have more to say about what fractional dimensionality is, but that's the unique part in mathematics to fractals, because they exist between regular dimensions. And so Taylor has used this way of rating dimensionality to authenticate or inauthenticate Jackson Pollock art. And Freud intuitively chose a fractal metaphor for the psyche. So this idea that the conscious mind is like an iceberg, a little bit of it exists outside above the water, and most of it is underneath, which symbolizes the unconscious. He again intuitively chose a fractal metaphor here. And his other one is of the onion, that the psyche is thought to be like an onion, where you can keep peeling and peeling and peeling and peeling forever and never get to any center. So life patterns, we looked at how these patterns exist in nature and in animals and in rocks and the cosmos, but patterns of behavior are also fractal in that our daily rituals are very similar. So there are behavioral fractals where we do similar behavior, self-similar behavior over time. We have repetitive relational patterns with people, and we have repetitive dreams often. And those repetitive dreams have a self-similar structure to them. Here is a drawing in 1987 by Charles Adams of self-similarity. And you can really see how he's got several different scales of man with the wind-up dolls and the wind-up dolls having other wind-up dolls. I turn out when I was a child, I had my first way of trying to conceive of infinity was, I think I was definitely in elementary school. Maybe I was in 3rd grade or so. I had this image of the universe inside the shoebox of a giant, and that whole universe was in the shoebox of yet another giant, etc., forever. At that point in time, the Big Bang Theory had not quite taken hold, and the universe was thought to be infinitely expandable. And so that was my image of infinity, which is not unlike this. It really did presage self-similarity, as did a dream that I had, which I'm going to tell you about in a little bit. The other thing that Richard Taylor has done as he's looked at the fractal dimensionality of the Rorschach blocks. So on the right here, you see a smooth edge rather than a fractal edge of the typical ink blot. The left is one of the standard ink blots that to me looks like 2 Indian maidens looking at each other. And what he discovered is that it's really the fractal edges that cause us to project into the ink blots, because when there is a smooth edge, we don't have a tendency to project in there at all. And so we begin to understand why we project shapes into clouds, since they too have these fractal edges. It turns out that the dimensionality of the fractal edge in the Rorschach is a little bit less than the natural dimensionality of objects in nature. So, as I mentioned, when fractals are iterated by computer, they're infinitely deep. The computer is only limited by its runtime. It just can keep magnifying. The longer it runs, the deeper it can go into the iteration of that formula. But in nature, we have natural boundaries to what's small and what's large that are limited on the small size by quantum elements, and limited on the large size by just the size of the universe. But in consciousness, our consciousness actually resembles more like the computer, that we can keep being a self-observing ourselves over and over again, and that there is essentially an infinite depth. Of course, it's not infinite because our lives are finite in length, but for all practical purposes, there is an infinite depth to processes of introspection, on the self, observing the self. And so this slide shows us some of the more profound aspects of what I'm going to call observer-dependent reality. I see I'm running out of time. I'm going to go faster, but you can see how, depending on the size of the yardstick, you see something very different at smaller scales, and that boundaries are fractal in nature, like this, and that when there are fractal processes between things, then our boundary conditions become very complex, such that we are fully in the universe, and the universe is at the same time fully within us, and that these similar, very complex boundaries are there between self and other, that are open and closed at the same time, depending on what scale we're looking at. Unhealthy boundaries are rigid, healthy ones are open and more complex. Fractal awareness is intuitive. Richard Feynman said nature uses only the largest threads to weave her patterns, so each small piece of her fabric reveals the organization of the entire tapestry. I would say intuition is fractal because we detect the part in the whole, or the whole in the part, and mind and brain, mind and matter are two sides of the same coin. And the sacred versus the profound is more blended in according to the system, so that non-ordinary forms of consciousness become more ordinary when infinity is able to be part of what's finite in nature. And the fractals occupy the spaces between our ordinary dimensions, so that sometimes our experience mirrors the self, and the macrocosm is reflected in the microcosm. So that's the whole and the part. And fractal architecture is very common in religious structures because they point towards the infinite, which is often thought of as God. So that fractals unify art, science, and spirituality, and interpenetration of inner and outer worlds. And they are profound because patterns exist simultaneously inside and outside of space and time, immanent and transcendent. They occupy infinite depths and expanses between finite dimensions like consciousness, imagination, and shamanism. And the equivalence of part and whole is like non-dual consciousness, and how the whole infuses the parts is very much how God is thought of. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you.
Wow. Well, Terry, you powered fast through those last. I was following you, and you powered fast through those last like 10 slides, and I felt like, oh my gosh, I need to go back and get more. But thank you so much for being here. We're gonna, as we told everybody, Terry will be on for a few minutes after I get done wrapping this up. But for people who have to leave on the hour, I just want to remind you that we have our webinar tomorrow is with Ahmed Abadre, part of his Decolonization for Wellbeing series. And then Judith Ehrman Shapiro is going to be here on Wednesday for a corrective perspective on empowerment after trauma. Really great. The first part's available on our website. Rebecca Gonzalez and Janessa Arredondo will be here on Thursday about protecting children from cyberbullying. And then Cassia, one of Be Strong Families board members, will be here on Friday for an interactive conversation on riding the Corona Coaster, holiday edition. So please join us for whenever you can. And the next slide, please, quick. Trying to end this. Amplify, let's get to build a better world. Next slide. Share your love, show your love. This is our campaign to support the webinar series. Would love it if you can donate, do. Next one. Or buy a mask. Please wear a mask, protect other people during this time. And these are lovely masks that are available on our website. Finally, if you or someone you know should do a webinar for us, please just write me. And that is what we have for the presentation. Anybody who would like to sign off should sign off. But people who have questions, Terry's going to be here, has agreed to graciously be here for the next 10 or so minutes. So, or Terry, how much time do you have?
I will be here as long as people want to have.
Well, there are a couple questions that came through in the chat that I was tracking that I think are really relevant. One was the role of was multi-generational trauma and epigenetics, and how we can apply fractal patterns to that. And the other one was a Jungian question that I know you would love to answer, which is about how do we think of individuation in Jungian individuation and fractals. So those were two questions. I don't know which one you would like to address.
And I see Tom just said that all the last part of the presentation, which was most geared towards spirituality, was obscured.
It wasn't. I mean, I could see them.
Yeah.
That's your browser, Tom?
No, it wasn't. It was that I had the poll. I didn't realize the poll was showing to everybody else at the end there. So all those cool slides, which I can move through again if people want to see, or people can, this presentation, of course, that will be up there though, won't it?
The slides are separate. The slides presentation will be downloadable, not just.
Right, but the presentation will include the poll at the end.
Other people saw the slides just fine.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, that's good. Anyway, yes, epigenetics is a very exciting new field that is absolutely a fractal process. Epigenetics is essentially how nature and nurture, how nurture changes our genetics, which used to be thought of as Lamarckian inheritance, and thought to be impossible. But actually, it turns out it is very possible that patterns get that what happens is the expression of genes is made possible through nurture, through our environmental experience, and then those changes get passed on to the next generation. And so people don't even realize that they're inheriting patterns from the generation before, and that's absolutely